So thank you.
It's my great pleasure and my great honor to be here. So thank you for the invitation. In 1970, when I was about 11 years old, I was a guest at a high school production of The Diary of Anne Frank. I had a first cousin who played the lead role, and that had a profound influence on that young 11-year-old. And for the past 5.5 decades, I have devoted considerable time in the reading, the studying, the teaching, and now writing of the Holocaust. And just wrestling during that over half a century with how men and women could commit such atrocities and could be in a situation like that, and discovering that the Holocaust was just one example in human history of genocide, and just one example of genocide towards the Jewish people. I went on to get a graduate degree in history with a focus in modern European history, a lot of coursework in German history and Holocaust studies. And in 1993, was teaching at a K-12 private school outside Jacksonville, Florida, and was asked to create an elective course for high school juniors and seniors on the Holocaust. So for 5 years, from 94 to 99, I taught a Holocaust studies class. And since that time, I've been asked periodically why a Gentile Christian with no Jewish heritage, no Jewish faith, why I would study and teach the Holocaust. And my response is the Holocaust is not a Jewish issue, it is a human issue. And as a Christian, I'm called to love my neighbor, no matter who my neighbor is. And I think we have a biblical response as Christians to, we are grafted into the Jewish family, and we have an obligation to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so therefore, I continue to read and study and teach the Holocaust. The book that I've written, actually today is the official release date. And so it was designed by the publisher to be released on today, with the special significance that today brings. I focus actually on 10 different people that spoke to my classes in the 1990s. I probably had 25 or 30 different speakers that came in, had some rabbis and some scholars. I had 20 or more Holocaust survivors, I had camp liberators, a couple of righteous Gentiles. But I focus on 10 of these, 8 survivors and a righteous Gentile, and then a liberator. And I'm going to focus on one in particular today, just some highlights. And the title of my book is I Will Give Them an Everlasting Name, Jacksonville Stories of the Holocaust. So in one sense, this is local history in Jacksonville, Florida, but in a much more important sense, it's much broader because it's not just Jacksonville, Florida. It's just in God's providence, all of these people ended up in Jacksonville, Florida. Ella Rogozinski from Czechoslovakia. She is the only one of these 10 subjects that is alive today. She is 97, suffering from Alzheimer's. The rest are now with the Lord. And I'll be speaking more about Ella here in just a moment. Carla Schipper from the Netherlands. She, along with her 2 infant daughters, hid in an attic for 2 years. Her husband was murdered. Renee Goldstein Jacob and her husband Leslie Jacob, both from Romania, survivors of multiple camps, And Leslie ended up escaping. It was in a Russian work camp, escaped from that, was in the resistance. Richard Friedemann, born in Krakow, Poland, his entire family was murdered at the hands of the Nazis, except for Richard and one brother. They survived 2 ghettos and 5 camps for 5 years. Rose Mibab Goldberg from Ludmir, Poland. Just about her entire family perished. She managed to live in a hole in the ground, kind of a septic tank, for 2 years with several other people, including a toddler niece that she rescued. Gina Frieden from Ludmir, Poland. She lost her entire family, including her first husband, was sent to a ghetto and then to Auschwitz, where she twice defied the gas chamber at Auschwitz. Leona Krohn from Poland. She and her husband lost every single member of their extended family. And you have to remember, in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe in the 1930s, your first cousins, your second cousins, your aunts, your uncles, your siblings, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, you all lived in the same community, the same part of the city. So when your family might mean 200, 300 people. And for most of these people, for all of these people, they were either the sole survivor or had 1 or 2 family members that survived. Leona and her husband escaped to a Siberian labor camp, where they spent the war in a Siberian work camp. Joe Williams, actually, up the road, Front Royal, Virginia. He was a young Army officer at the time, as a lieutenant. He helped liberate Dachau concentration camp, but then remained in Germany for 3 years after the war as the deputy commandant of Landsberg prison, where the Nazi war criminals were housed. He was in charge of the executioners. And he interviewed and got to know many of the top Nazi war criminals during that 3-year period. And then Dr. Ernst Trier Merck, the first anesthesiologist in Denmark, inventor of the respirator, later immigrated to the U.S., became the head of the University of Chicago School of Medicine before retiring outside of Jacksonville. He was a righteous Gentile involved in the Danish evacuation of their Jews to neutral Sweden, did miraculous things. We noticed on the slides the many thousands, hundreds of thousands, a total of 6 million Jews that were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. You didn't see Denmark. In part because of Dr. Merck and people like him. He, not single-handedly, but played a key role in the rescue of 8,000 Danish Jews. Not a single Danish Jew died in the gas chambers. So, Ella Rogozinski, I'll speak a little bit about her. In the 1990s, she spoke to my class 5 years in a row. She was in her 70s. She did not drive, so I would pick her up. She still worked full-time at a jewelry store. Once I took her to lunch, but she was very upset because she didn't want to miss work. And she was a pleasant and kind woman with sparkling eyes, a jovial sense of humor, always smiling, and she tended to say exactly what she thought. I would call her zesty. She was short and stocky. She described herself as a short, plump Jewish woman. And she would bounce around my classroom of high school students, her eyes sparkling yet intense, sharing her story that they so desperately wanted and needed to hear. Self-deprecating, winsome, she would light up the room. Her warm spirit and her smile and the power of her story drew her listeners in as they yearned to know more about this very dignified lady who had long before experienced so much horror and tragedy. At one point, Excuse me, at one point near the end of each testimony, Ella would hold out her left forearm and roll up her sleeve and show us the number A5674 tattooed there and still readily visible half a century later. The number was a constant reminder and a permanent reminder of the 18 months that she spent at Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, when she was the same age as these young high school students that she was addressing. Ella was born Ella Lukács in a small town in Czechoslovakia that's now part of Ukraine. She was born in 1927. She had an older brother and two older sisters, and together they had what she described as an idyllic childhood. She recalls having many friends, both Jews and Christians, and a loving family. They lived in an upper middle class existence, spoke Yiddish in the home, but Ella had a real gift for language. She also was fluent not only in Yiddish, but Russian, German, Hungarian, Czech, and Hebrew. She loved languages and said that her fluency ultimately saved her life. About a third of her classmates were Jewish. The rest were Gentile, predominantly Polish Catholic, a few Ukrainians. She said she rarely experienced anti-Semitism in her early years. Her family was religiously observant, where their Jewish faith and traditions were central in their lives. That changed, however, when she was about 11 in 1938, when the Germans began taking over Czechoslovakia. Suddenly, her Gentile friends stopped coming over to play, and Christian families stopped coming to the family store. And in 1941, 3 years later, the family was transported to the Kolomia ghetto. The Germans began establishing ghettos in Eastern Europe. The largest proportion of Jews lived not in Germany or Western Europe, but in Eastern Europe. And so the ghettos were holding centers, so to speak, to concentrate Jewish families in tight quarters, and until they were either killed or rounded up and sent to concentration work camps or one of the 6 death camps in Poland. Conditions in the ghettos were Spartan. Little food or water, multiple families, often 15, 20, 25 people living in a single apartment. After 18 months in the ghetto, where they worked in a nearby forced labor camp outside the walls during the day, the Lukács family was transported by train to another ghetto in tightly packed cattle cars. No room to sit or move, no bathrooms, no food, no water. Ella described that the air smelled of rotting flesh and human excrement. Many prisoners died in the cattle car en route. It took over a week. They spent about a month at the next ghetto, and then the family was once again packed in a cattle car and transported this time to Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. Ella, both her parents and her 3 siblings, were handed 2 pails for this trip in the cattle car. These were their bathrooms. 250 people crammed in a single rail car for an 8-day journey to Auschwitz. When they finally arrived, exhausted, starving, ill, and filthy, they were forced out of the train onto the camp ramp. Dozens of German guards shouted, "Schnell, quickly." It was nighttime, she described it. Dogs were barking, confusion reigned. In Ella's words, dogs, noise, raus, raus, out, out. And from that moment on, everything was fast. Schnell, schnell. Everything had to be done schnell. We had to jump down, even little children and old people. Ella went on, remembering that some guards ripped babies from their mother's arms. The women screamed and hollered, and they were shooting. The men and women were separated into 2 lines, and the selection process began. She recalls that a, quote, good-looking man in uniform with a leather coat and perfectly polished boots, she later learned that it was Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, did the selecting. Those sent to the right were chosen to live and go to the work camp. Those sent to the left were marched directly to the gas chambers. Ella and her two sisters, Helga and Olga, were led to a stark, cold holding room. And you see Ella with her two sisters. This obviously is after the war. Just to give that away, they all three survived. They were sent to a holding room. There they were stripped, 3 teenage girls, and their entire bodies shaved. They stayed overnight. In the morning, they were given their blue and white striped camp uniform and wooden clogs, or as Ella described them, Holland shoes. And they were taken to another temporary barracks. The girls realized that their mother, their 2 aunts, and their young cousin were not with them. They presumed they had been sent to the other line, to the left, not knowing what that meant at the time. Already famished upon arrival, having little or no food for days, food was withheld for another week. Hunger would continue to be with them for months and months. Several members of the group asked the guard, where are our parents? Where's the rest of our family? And they were told, see that smoke? Don't you smell it? Don't you see they're in the smoke? They're in the sky. Like big black clouds, one observer remarked afterwards, the smoke of the crematorium hung over the camp. Sharp red tongues of flame behind the sky, and the air was full of nauseating smell of burning flesh. 50 years later, Ella quietly, with hesitation, recalled, as her sparkling eyes grew distant, dim, and misty, quote, it took us maybe 2 months before we believed it. We didn't believe it until we convinced ourselves that every single day people go in and nobody came out. Ella can never forget the pungent smell of burning flesh that hung in the air that night and in the nights and days that followed. She soon came to learn that this was the smell of the crematorium. She recalled, even after half a century, you don't know how flesh burns, but sometimes if you put margarine on the stove, terrible. It stays in your throat for months and months, that smell. She recalled that she could never grill on a barbecue grill because the smell of the burning beef reminded her of the burning flesh. When Ella finally received food, her diet consisted of 1 potato or 1 cabbage daily, and occasionally a bowl of watery soup. Soon, it was even less than that. She was given a single piece of bread and a bowl of water to be shared by 8 people. Ella began to approach death by starvation. Excuse me. All 3 of the sisters, she and her 2 sisters, were in the same barracks. Their work assignment was to put clothes taken from the murdered prisoners into boxes to be sent back to Germany. The building where the young women worked was located very close to one of the crematoria. They sorted and cleaned the clothing that the gas prisoners had left behind in the disrobing rooms. 12 or more hours a day, they combed through the mounds of Jewish wallets, purses, and clothing, including looking for money that may have been hidden. These were the clothes taken from the Jews immediately prior to them gasping for their final breaths in the Auschwitz gas chambers. She said everything went into boxes. Day after day, big trucks came with everything. With pillows and shoes, thousands and thousands of glasses and everything. Everything went away to Germany. Their work went on for month after month. She said, I never saw anyone coming out. It was a terrible thing. One father worked there and put his own son in the oven. Jewish musicians were ordered to form an orchestra, and they would play beautiful classical music designed to keep the prisoners calm before they went to work or were sent to the gas chambers. Ella and her sisters withstood the nightmare of Auschwitz for 18 months. Early on, after about 2 months, Ella got quite sick and lost her voice. And this lasted for 2.5 years, including it was a year after her liberation before she could really speak again. As the Nazi killing machine murdered thousands of her people day after day, Ella said, "I died 1,000,000 times." Yet she remained stoic, bottling up her anger and sadness, never crying. These were horrific days for a teenage girl. News ultimately came that their father had died. He had been forced to work in backbreaking slave labor, and despite the efforts of his son, who worked alongside him and helped him with the punishing work, he was unable to maintain the routine. Immediately after his father died, Ella's brother committed suicide, throwing himself against the electric fence. He was 21. Ella knew that if she and her sisters were going to survive, they would need to not only be strong and courageous, but smart. They kept it a secret that they were sisters because they knew that they would likely be separated or killed if the information got out. So the three sisters shrewdly disciplined themselves by rationing the little food they received, looking out for one another each and every day. One example is every morning when the prisoners got a single slice of moldy bread, most prisoners would immediately devour it, but Ella and her sisters would cut it into small strips and have one little piece for breakfast, one for lunch, one for dinner, to try to spread out their nutrition a little bit more through the day. For their constant thirst, they were given a big bowl of scalding hot tea, and 20 people had to drink from it. And the rest of the day, they had nothing more to drink. They had a 4 o'clock wake up every morning and had to stand in line for an hour for their tea, their piece of bread, and maybe, if they were lucky, a bowl of soup to share with 20 others. Occasionally, Ella would hear the screams of the children who were being used for the horrific medical experiments conducted by Dr. Mengele and his staff. She saw children being taken inside the medical building, yet she never saw any of them leave. She didn't know any details of what was going on until after the war, but she knew that it was horrific. She knew that it was a place of evil and death. Ella recalled that every Sunday, the German officers played a game where they lined up the prisoners and counted them off by a random number. Those selected, like every third or every fourth, were shot and killed. This was a game for them that went on for hours at a time. The guards also used many of the female prisoners as prostitutes. Ella recalled that, quote, "They came around and they chose very pretty girls for the German soldiers. So it was. You lived always with fear. You didn't know what you do right. You don't know what you do wrong. You were ugly, it wasn't good. You were pretty, it wasn't good. But that's how life was." Ella said that the Nazis created a camp where you, quote, became an animal. I don't know if you understand, but sometimes, and these are Ella's words, sometimes a mother and child or sister, if she died, you kept it a secret for the night so you can have her bread. And the minute she died, if she had better shoes or something, you took them off. Ella paused, then continued. But it was no tears. You know, it was like, oh, thank God she died. Even Ella, the kind, gentle, and loving teenager, was reduced to a survival of the fittest mode. And the nightmare of such human reduction impacted her long after the hell of Auschwitz was over. Ella and her sisters experienced almost unimaginable evil and suffering day after day, and yet they persevered. They endured more than 2 years in 2 ghettos and the 18 long months at Auschwitz, a site where more than 1 million people were murdered in the gas chambers. The overwhelming majority of them were Jews. The test of their endurance was not yet over. More trials were yet to come, perhaps even more difficult than the abyss of Auschwitz. In January of 1945, just months before the end of the war, the Soviet army invaded Poland and began to defeat the occupying German army. Most of the surviving prisoners at Auschwitz were evacuated from the camp as the invading Russian soldiers rapidly approached. They were forced to march westward from Auschwitz in Poland to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany, a distance of nearly 450 miles. As the German military force collapsed, the Allied armies began closing in on these Nazi concentration camps, and so the Germans would move them. Ella was on the unthinkably cruel death march from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, which took 3 months. When they left, they were markedly malnourished, underweight, sick, and weak. They were near death. They had no warm clothes and wore camp-issued wooden clogs with no socks, while they were forced marched through sub-zero temperatures in snow and ice. Ella recalled walking, weeks and weeks and days with nothing on. Freezing snow, hungry, no food, no nothing. We just eat the snow. At one point in the long journey, Ella's sister, 22-year-old Olga, 4 years older than Ella, developed severe frostbite on several of her toes after losing her clogs and having to continue barefoot for several days. One foot turned blue, then black from the frostbite. Her sisters knew that she would not survive if they didn't take drastic and quick action. Either the infection would quickly kill her, or her inability to walk would mean the guards would shoot her. Ella recalled, "My sister, the older sister, took off Olga's shoes, and the toes were black. So somebody said, 'Helga, you have to do something, because if the Germans would saw that she cannot walk fast enough, they would shoot her.' So they determined that they must cut off her middle toes. The oldest sister, 25-year-old Helga, walked ahead for half a day and was able to borrow a pair of rusty scissors from another prisoner who was a nurse. Ella described the scene to me 50 years later. Quote, "My sister walked one way, brought the scissors, took off the 2 toes. We put snow on, and she had to take back the scissors to that lady." Ella and Helga cut off Olga's infected toes to prevent gangrene, which in those awful circumstances would certainly result in death. There was no anesthesia, no penicillin, antibiotics, or medicine of any sort to numb the pain or prevent infection. Ella recalled that if a prisoner slowed, they would be, quote, "put on the side of the road to die or shot on the spot." So Ella and Helga carried Olga for the rest of the long, grueling walk. She said, "That's how we walked, miles and miles to that camp." They trudged through the snow as if in a daze, putting one frozen foot in front of the other, starving and weak. Ella recalled that she, quote, "envied the dogs and wanted so badly to eat as well as they did." She said, "We were freezing to death." After a while, all 3 sisters were walking without shoes. Although thousands of prisoners died on this death march, the Lukács trio once again fought for their lives. After their long, cold journey, frail and barely alive, the sisters arrived at yet another concentration camp. They reached Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany, which Ella described as hell. After the prisoners made it to Bergen-Belsen, they were not fed for 5 days. Then 10 or more people were forced to drink a few ounces of filthy water from the same bowl. Their one small daily meal, watery soup or stale bread, was shared by a group as well. When the meager rations were distributed, mothers and children fought each other for a single piece of bread. Prisoners were filthy, covered with lice, often running high fevers, rife with disease, malnourished and starved, and alarmingly underweight. What little strength was left after leaving Auschwitz was all but depleted by the time they arrived at Bergen. normal. Finally, one day, Ella and the others heard tanks nearby. The soldiers in the tanks who would soon liberate Bergen-Belsen were British, along with some Canadian units. Dehydrated, malnourished, emaciated, and weakened bodies meant death for many, even after liberation. Indeed, as the British 11th Armored Division entered Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, their soldiers were totally unprepared for what they found. Inside the camp fences, they discovered more than 60,000 emaciated, feeble prisoners in dire need of immediate medical attention. They also soon came upon more than 13,000 corpses in various stages of decomposition, scattered all around the camp. One member of the British Army described the scene of unburied bodies. He wrote, "The bodies were a ghastly sight. Some were green. They looked like skeletons covered with skin. The flesh had all gone. There were bodies of small children among the grown-ups. In other parts of the camp, there were hundreds of bodies lying around, in many cases piled 5 or 6 high." Another British soldier described the scene. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't believe people could sink to that level and treat people the way they treated these prisoners." He was recalling this 75 years later. Ella and her family, now made up of only Ella, Helga, Olga, and their Aunt Leah, at long last were liberated. The Lukács girls were finally free. They had survived the Nazi death grip. Nevertheless, the happiness they felt after the emancipation was bittersweet. They had to acknowledge the sorrow they felt about the deaths of their brother, their parents, and other family members who had perished. So they had survived the effects of their years in 2 ghettos and 2 camps. Ella at 18, at 5 feet tall, Ella at 18 was at 5 feet tall, weighed 52 pounds. She was close to death, little more than a skeleton, and barely strong enough to walk, unable to speak, yet she was alive. She had survived. For a while after liberation, Ella said that she hated everybody, but soon found that, quote, "the hate was eating at me." She had lost both her parents, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, her brother, multiple cousins, along with virtually all of her childhood friends. Altogether, she lost over 60 relatives. She lamented a half-century later, quote, "I hope I die before something bad happens again to children, Jewish or non-Jewish." After being freed from Bergen-Belsen, the 3 Lukács girls were soon transported to a displaced persons camp in Germany, and it was there that she met Jacob Rogozinski, a Holocaust survivor from Poland. They quickly fell in love, and within weeks, they were married in the DP camp. And all 3 sisters were married within weeks of one another, and they all wore the same wedding dress. Ella and Jacob spent 3 years in the DP camp before immigrating to Israel to be with Jacob's one surviving brother. They lived in Israel for 7.5 years. Their first 2 sons, Chaim and Abraham, were born there, but they were disappointed living in Israel. There was more war. She said, "It was not what I expected." They endured what she said was a battlefield of hate during the Suez-Sinai War of 1956 and 57. Ella was ready for the bombs, the tanks, and the sirens to stop. The fear of war and terror reminded her too much of her past. She dreamed of moving to the United States. I have allergies. Olga and Helga had immigrated to Jacksonville, Florida. So finally, in 1959, Ella and her family moved there. Though Ella was fluent in 7 languages, she did not speak one word of English. She and her husband Jacob and 2 boys had $8.50. She recalled, I couldn't read or write English. I had no profession. I was just a little girl from Czechoslovakia. They knew, nonetheless, that America would be their home. Their lives in their new home would not be easy, but the hard work, resilience, and strength gained from what they had withstood would help find them success living an American dream of their own. Ella and Jacob's third son, Sam, good name, was born in Jacksonville in 1960. When the immigrant Rogozinski family moved there in 1959 with no English and no money, they were unable to afford an apartment. So they briefly lived in what she called a little shack. Finally, they moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment, but they were only able to live there for 2 weeks because when the landlord found out they were Jewish, he forced them out. To help support a family of 5, Ella worked in a bakery, washing large pots for 35 cents an hour. She had 2 more jobs, cleaning a hotel and cleaning houses for a few more dollars. Jacob was an auto mechanic, earning $42 a month. With sheer determination and hard work, the couple finally saved enough money to purchase what would be their first home, a modest one with a mortgage of $50 a month. After they paid the mortgage on their tiny home each month, they had little left for anything else, but they enjoyed the bounty of their new home and new life. Ella declared, America was a dream. America was a dream for me. For decades, Jacob continued to work as an auto mechanic, moonlighting at UPS, and then holding a third job, cleaning a post office. By 1980, Ella was polishing silver and repairing jewelry at Underwood's Jewelry, which is one of the prominent jewelry stores in Jacksonville. And she held that job into her mid-80s, only retiring when Alzheimer's set in. Even when her 3 sons were making a lot of money, she did not need to work anymore. She was determined to succeed and also to prove that she and her family were just as good as everyone else. While the boys were growing up, Ella would take them to the library so that she would help them to study, but also the library had air conditioning. They didn't have that in Florida at their home. And it was at the library that Ella could practice learning her English as her young boys were learning to read. Ella and her 3 boys, and Jacob's 3 boys were their greatest joy. By working multiple jobs, and she said, eating a lot of chicken bones, Ella and Jacob said they were able to send their boys to, quote, the best colleges. They instilled good work ethics in their boys, and they expected much from them in return. All 3 sons received college scholarships, and Ella said they received straight A's. She admitted that she was a taskmaster, always pushing them toward excellence, expecting nothing less than their best. She wanted each of them to appreciate the remarkable opportunities they had in what she called America, the best country in the world. The Rogozinski home, however, was no democracy. Her boys said, we never got a vote. Things were never discussed or negotiated, her son Abe recalled with a smile. It was a constant give and take between us wanting to become very Americanized. We were the new kids, immigrants, and our parents were holding on to old world values. And I have to admit, they won. All 3 of us are grateful. Chaim and Abe became prominent orthopedic surgeons, and Sam earned a business degree, and he manages their medical practice. They own and operate the thriving Rogozinski Clinic in Jacksonville, specializing in spinal injuries and surgeries. Doctor told Ella and Jacob that they would never be able to have children. But today, their clan includes not only their 3 sons, but 11 grandchildren and 12 great-grandchildren, and growing. Ella and Jacob's descendants have not only embraced the American dream, they have contributed, enjoyed, and flourished in the cultural fabric of the nation. The family has successfully defied and defeated the Nazi goal of eradicating the European Jews. The Nazis did managed to murder 6 million of the 9 million Jews in Europe. They had many chances to return to their home countries, but Ella and Jacob never did. Ella said, every time I see something nice about Czechoslovakia, I think, let's go. In her 70s, she said that. And then she says, no, America's my home. She still owned a house there that she and her sisters inherited from their parents. But she says, who cares? It's just a house. She says, America is their home. She told me in 1995, quite emphatically, if people would know what America is, if Jewish people, American Jewish people, or Catholics who grow up in America, do they know what they have? They don't. They don't appreciate. They complain about taxes. They complain about everything. It's America the beautiful. I'm just afraid it can happen again. You see the skinheads. It's terrifying. It can happen. That people can do that to people. Why? People can do that to people. They make an animal out of you. I had so much hate in me after the war, so much hate. I try to forget, but I cannot completely forgive. My children are so successful. People come back and they talk to me, Ella, what a wonderful life you made for yourself. And she said, sweetheart, nobody gave us a penny. We put penny and penny together. My son was already a doctor. He drove a 10-year-old car because he paid off his medical loans. He said, Mom, America gave me a chance. I'm going to pay back every penny. Ella did lose her religious faith for about 2 decades, but eventually returned to her Jewish faith. She and Jacob began attending synagogue once again, taking comfort in coming back to their faith tradition. She came to believe that God worked in her life, despite the harshness that she had experienced. As evidence, she pointed to her children. You wouldn't believe it, she said, but I have 2 surgeon sons here in town, she said in a 1998 interview with me. They've traveled the world to teach other doctors different kinds of surgery with the things they invented. Don't you think God chose me for a purpose? Ella and Jacob rarely spoke of the world they left behind and the incredible hardships they experienced. Ella never wanted Chaim, Abe, and Sam to hate. That was all in a life past, and America was their home now, a land of opportunity and hope and freedom. She called the United States, quote, a storybook, and said that she had enjoyed a wonderful life. She was married to Jacob for 47 years before he died. She said, I know what hate is. I know what hunger is. But I'm very lucky to be in America. When I knew Ella in the mid and late 1990s, she was in her 70s. She no longer weighed 52 pounds as she had at age 18. Her eyes were vibrant and piercing, her smile frequent, as was her laughter and self-deprecating humor. Again, she constantly referred to herself as a fat old Jewish woman. More than once, she shared that her sons bought her frequently very expensive dresses. Laughing her delightful laugh, she'd ask, what's an old fat Jewish lady needing with such nice dresses? She admitted she donated every dress to the poor, who needed them much more than I did. So perhaps this aptly captures Ella's life in short example. She never took herself too seriously. Enjoyed a life filled with laughter and set high standards for her family, pushing them to attain those goals. She never forgot from whence she came and constantly sought to help those less fortunate than she. And still, Ella Rogozinski, number A, 85674, never forgot. Her days in the ghettos, in Auschwitz-Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen, and on the death march, remained forever etched in her mind and eternally burned in her soul, as well as her forearm. She said, you don't believe what people do to people. She would often remind those who listened. A lot of times, I'm still very sad. People ask, how do you survive? Ella said she always responds, there's always a better day. There's always a better day. And you eat a little piece of bread. Just a footnote, I met Ella in 1995 and 1994, and she spoke 5 years in a row in my class. In 1997, when my wife and I got engaged, we picked out our wedding bands from Ella, Underwood Jewelers. So she was very delighted to meet my wife. So, anyway, may we never forget. Thank you. And